What's the story here? I've been a guide in Zion since about, I don't know, 2014, and a volunteer in Zion since about 2015. And I just love this place. I think my heart mapped to this place when I was 8 years old, and this is my home ground in a very ancestral way somehow. And when I take people out, the story that I love to tell them is sort of twofold. One is very much right here in front of us. And it has to do, it has to do with Zion, but it also has to do with the relationship between Zion and the Grand Canyon and Bryce, because a lot of people that come here go to all three parks. And so I like to place them, to orient them to where they are in time here as far as these layers go. From the bottom of the Grand Canyon to the top of Bryce, there are 37 layers. There's a variety of numbers you'll hear, but for this today we'll say 37 layers. The bottom 27 are in the Grand Canyon. The ceiling of the Grand Canyon is the floor of Zion. The next 7 layers are Zion. The ceiling of Zion is the floor of Bryce, and Bryce has the last 3 layers. And so, as far as time goes, the very bottom layers are the oldest, and everything else was stacked on top of them. And as you go through this country, it's amazingly mind-bending to think more and more and more and really try to get into your bones what these layers are, because every single layer, when it was the active layer on the surface of the earth, was a different world, completely different world. Our main layer here, the 2,000 feet of sandstone, when it was the active world, it was sand dunes. Deposited, wind-blown sand deposited over eons, eventually covered with a shallow sea so that the particles of sand were fused together into rock, became sandstone under pressure and from the interaction with the water. And then it was uplifted. The Colorado Plateau was uplifted because the tectonic plate from the Pacific came in, pushed it up. The river cut a canyon. So on top of this layer, there's a layer of limestone. Below this layer, there's a different kind of layer that's got more clay. It was more streams and shallow lakes and a little more muddy. It wasn't sand dunes. So some of these layers were jungles, had dinosaurs. We've got dinosaur tracks all around here, not in Zion, but at different layers in this continuum from the bottom of the Grand Canyon to the top of Bryce. There are places that were oceans, there are places that were deserts, or I should say times that were oceans and times that were deserts. Every single layer was a different world. That fact all by itself blows my mind. The more I really take that in. So one of the things I like to think about to help myself engage with this country is to think about the bottom of the Grand Canyon. The rock down there is 1.3 billion years old. The Earth itself is 4.4 billion years old. So a question could be raised: what happened to the other 3 billion years? Because the basement rock in the Grand Canyon is about as old as rock gets. And so the answer to that question is really interesting. To answer that question, you have to think of the Earth not as a set, so to speak, set in stone thing, but you have to think of the Earth as a cycle, geology itself. as a cycle. And the way that works is there are basically three main kinds of rocks: the sedimentary, igneous, metamorphic. It's just very basic geology. And I could pick up, if I had thought to do it first, I could pick up, well, here's a metamorphic right here, piece of basalt. Here's a piece of sandstone, that's sedimentary. The basalt is igneous. And then if I grabbed a piece of chert, which I'm sure there's one out here, that would be our metamorphic. And so they're very distinct rocks. I can hold them in my hand. But the true story of the geology is that it's a cycle. And so always when you're talking about a cycle, you just have to start somewhere. So we'll start with the igneous, that is the molten rock down in the mantle that under pressure pushes itself up through the crust of the earth and arrives on the surface or near the surface. If it's granite, it doesn't break through the surface. If it's basalt or lava, it does break through the surface, maybe as a volcano, maybe as a seep or a flow. At any rate, this hard igneous rock arrives on the scene, and it's there quite a long time because it's very hard, very dense. But eventually, it erodes and it turns into little particles that blow around. Some of this rock becomes the blowing sand that then turned into sandstone. And so the process of erosion, blowing around, re-lithification it's called when it turns back into rock. These two might go in their own cycle. The little motes in here that might be the cycle they live in. Or one or the other of these might get pushed further and further down through the crust of the earth, down far enough that it gets put under incredible heat and pressure, and it becomes a metamorphic rock. It completely changes. So if I had my third, this is not a metamorphic rock, but we're going to just say there's our third rock. This one might come back up and get eroded and turn into little bits and pieces of dust and turn back into sandstone. Or any one of these three might keep getting pushed down, 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 and eventually, below everything, they go back into the cauldron. So they're molten rock again until they reemerge as igneous rock. So it's all a big cycle, and these rocks that seem so permanent are really impermanent. They'll be changing. They'll be either eroded or pushed down and reemerge as igneous. So the question that leads me to, that I'd love to play with, is if that's true, if the earth is actually in the business of turning itself inside out, which it is, the earth is in the process continually of turning itself inside out, what does that make me? I'm standing on this earth that is in the process of turning everything inside out. And I ask that question of people. I love hearing different people's answers to that. Some people say, well, it makes me incredibly insignificant. Some people say it makes me very significant. And one time I got the answer that I've come up with from a 13-year-old kid. He says, well, I guess it makes me a rock. That is the conclusion I've come to, is that I really cannot find any other answer than that at the bottom of everything I am a fast-moving rock. And I love the thought because it connects me to these rocks that to me I feel a presence of these rocks. I feel zero judgment or, that's, they're way too still for that. But I do feel this very deep sense of, wow, look what she just did. I wouldn't have thought of that. What's she going to do next? So I actually have this relationship with these big rocks that feels interested, curious, loving, unattached, completely non-attached, but curious and interested. And I love moving through the world with that feeling. I love it. Because there's been plenty of times that me as my little human self, I can judge myself, I can judge my species, I can certainly go into that deep hall of mirrors, and I don't like to. So this just helps me keep a little more playful with the thought and the wondering about who I am. Is for whatever reason, at this moment, I'm a fast-moving rock with opposable thumbs, with a lot of agency and a lot of ability to do something while I'm here that in some ways matters a whole lot, in some ways matters not at all, if you think in terms of different levels of time. But it keeps me in a space that I really like. The last little thought that comes to me as I think about myself as a fast-moving rock and having these imaginings about whatever the consciousness might be of the big rocks, I think about hummingbirds. And I've talked to people that postulate that maybe hummingbirds are moving so quickly that to us, to them, we look like rocks.